This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/stay well. Children up to Year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu, as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze, and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter.
COVID-19 is in our communities and the number of cases is on the rise. So it's essential that we each play our part in full by following all of the government guidance. Only by doing this can we keep our schools and businesses open. If you're young and healthy, you may feel the virus isn't a threat to you. But someone more vulnerable to coronavirus than you, perhaps someone closer to you than you realise, is depending on you to play your part in breaking the chain of transmission. So I'm asking everyone to do their bit. Stick to the rule of 6 for gatherings indoors or outdoors. Wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. Wear a face covering in enclosed spaces. Observe social distancing of 2 metres or 1 metre plus precautions where 2 metres really isn't possible. Follow all of the guidelines about car sharing. If you have symptoms, self-isolate and get a free test immediately. If we work together on this, we can control the spread of the virus. Thank you.
My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action to investigate and deal with them, deploying extra testing capacity if we need to, or contact tracing as appropriate. The plan also deals with how we will continue to provide support for people who are made vulnerable because they need to self-isolate, and we'll be doing that through our community support hub. and we'll refine the plan as we go along to reflect the latest best practice and the information which government will be providing to the Council. Finally, I want to acknowledge the lengths to which so many people and organisations have gone to already in recent months to stick with the guidance, to maintain social distancing of 2 metres wherever possible, to wash your hands thoroughly and frequently, to stay at home if you or someone in your household has symptoms, to get tested and to follow the advice that you receive when you get the result. By observing the guidance, you're protecting not only your own life and livelihood, that of your friends and also your loved ones, but also that of people you may never meet, but people who you're depending on and whom we must each depend as well. Your role in that is critical. Thank you for your help to contain the virus.
This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/staywell. Children up to Year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter.
COVID-19 is in our communities and the number of cases is on the rise. So it's essential that we each play our part in full by following all of the government guidance. Only by doing this can we keep our schools and businesses open. If you're young and healthy, you may feel the virus isn't a threat to you. But someone more vulnerable to coronavirus than you, perhaps someone closer to you than you realise, is depending on you to play your part in breaking the chain of transmission. So I'm asking everyone to do their bit. Stick to the rule of 6 for gatherings indoors or outdoors. Wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. Wear a face covering in enclosed spaces. Observe social distancing of 2 metres or 1 metre plus precautions where 2 metres really isn't possible. Follow all of the guidelines about car sharing. If you have symptoms, self-isolate and get a free test immediately. If we work together on this, we can control the spread of the virus. Thank you.
My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements.
The hearing is resumed. This morning's session we will consider Minerals Provision Policies MP1 and MP2, and that is excluding part MP2P. And there's a separate session this afternoon for that. Now, I understand today, in addition to the participants that were here yesterday, we have representatives of CEMEX.
Yes, good morning, Mark Kelly.
Good morning. And Lincolnshire County Council.
Yes.
Could you, yeah.
Good morning, Mike Daly.
Good morning. And also, I understand there's a representative of Greenfield Environmental here.
Sorry, sir. There's also I'm Adrian Winkley. I'm a Lincolnshire County Council as well.
I'm
the Minerals and Waste Policy and Compliance Manager.
Good morning.
Thank you.
And Simon Rees from Greenfield Environmental.
Yeah, good morning, sir.
Morning. Just to remind you all, on MS Teams, if you wish to speak at any time, please use the raise hand facility, which is the symbol on at the top of the screen. I ask that you don't use the screen share facility, please. And also, please ensure that your microphones are muted other than when you wish to speak. If anyone wishes to switch off their camera during the session, you can do. Hello. I seem to have lost the connection temporarily there for a minute, but anyway, if anyone does experience loss of connection, please contact the programme officer, Ian Kemp, and he will attempt to get you reconnected. Just to briefly run through the progress so far on the Minerals Local Plan, I produced my matters, issues and questions, and then followed that up with supplementary questions. The Council and other participants have provided their responses, which are in hearing statements, which are on the examination website. There is a hearing programme and an agenda, which are also on the website. The participants listed in each session will have the opportunity to put their cases, and others will have the opportunity to respond, and I may also have some questions. My role is to consider the soundness of the plan in accordance with the criteria in the National Planning Policy Framework. The purpose of the hearing sessions is to assist me in this. The starting point is that the Council has submitted a plan that it considers to be sound. And if you are challenging the soundness of the plan, then I would ask that you explain why you think it is unsound and what changes would make the plan sound. I have read and taken into account the original representations that were made. There is no need for those to be repeated. Instead, my aim is that the discussion moves on from those submissions and deals with specific questions that I may have, or where points of further clarification or explanation are required. Please, would you keep your discussion focused on the matter in hand and avoid commenting on unrelated matters. I would ask that you're concise and specific in responding to the specific points, but it would be helpful to me if you do wish to refer to any parts of your statement or any particular documents. That would be helpful to me when reporting. I will ask questions today. That doesn't indicate any predisposition. It doesn't indicate that I've made up my mind on anything. I'm just exploring and testing the evidence. The council has produced a list of modifications to the plan, and that's published on the website. The list will be added to as we go through the examination, and the final list of main modifications will be published for public consultation after this hearing and before I prepare my report. The examination will remain open until my report is submitted to the council. No further representations or evidence will be accepted after the hearing sessions are finished unless I specifically request this. The entitlement to speak on a particular policy only exists where previous representations have been made on it and where changes are sought. So discussion on each policy is limited to those listed. And it is not permissible to hear comments in support of particular policies or allocations, or about sites which are not proposed for allocation, because the purpose of this hearing is just to hear views on whether the policies are sound. Does anyone have any questions before we start today? Okay, if we could go on then to policy MP1, please, which deals with the aggregate provision. Could we start off with the representatives of the industry, please? And then we can move on to Lincolnshire County Council following that. Yes, Mr. North.
Thank you, sir. My hand. As you pointed out, I've already submitted detailed submissions to you, sir, in response to your matters and issues and in response to the consultation on the publication draft. So, bearing in mind that we do have several representatives of industry here today, my plan this morning is really just to set some headlines and a bit of context for others to come in behind. I think the key issue I have is that Nottinghamshire appear to be using the 10-year average only in trying to forecast their demand, and national policy is very clear that forecasted demand should be based not only on a rolling average of 10 years and other relevant local informations, but an assessment of all supply options. And planning guidance goes on further and clearly states that forecasts must not be based solely on the 10-year rolling average. If we look at housing in Nottinghamshire, Nottinghamshire's own evidence and LAO shows there's been a 71% increase in housing between 2013 and 16, which appears to have met largely by imports to the county. And we have to also remember that housing only represents 25% of demand for aggregates. The other 75% is made up of major infrastructure, general infrastructure and commercial build. Continuing on the topic of housing, Nottinghamshire's LAA indicate an annual housing completion rate of 4,574. If looking back at history, we find a time when similar housing completions were made. That was back in 2005, at which point Nottinghamshire extraction rate annually was 3.08 million tonnes. Currently, the LAA that this plan is based on is showing 1.7 million tonnes, but that's purely based on a 10-year average. And there's no other consideration of infrastructure projects that may impact the county. Furthermore, the LAA in Table 6 clearly shows the significant increase in imports into the county from surrounding areas, a rise of 78%. And that's shown if you compare AM 2009 with AM 2014. that increase in imports can be seen. Again, looking at the LAA, we can see that the regional increase in sales for East Midlands rose from 5.5 million tonnes to 6.96 million tonnes between the period 2009 and 16. It fell slightly in 2017, but it represents a regional growth of around 23% to 26%. But only in Nottinghamshire, in the East Midlands, have we seen sales apparently flatline. And the reason for this, we would suggest, is as a result of the recession, commercial decisions by operators to mothball. And this, of course, has been caught by Nottinghamshire's sort of myopic approach in using a 10-year average only. You're inevitably going to capture that reduction in production, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I have suggested, or I have indicated in my response to you, sir, on matters and issues, a couple of examples of how one could forecast. One using housing and one using Oxfordshire County Council's own calculations used in their mineral plan, which was found sound as an approach in their examination. Both those methods, you will see, produce figures significantly in excess of the 1.7 million tonnes proposed by Nottinghamshire. The one point about the Oxfordshire thing is it puts the Oxfordshire approach was designed because Oxfordshire recognised that they were in a recession and they needed to try and capture demand correctly and put themselves in a position, a similar position that they were pre-recession. However, the Oxfordshire approach didn't actually take into account any future growth of demand. Finally, so in summary, the limited use of the 10-year average, not considering other factors, as I've outlined to you, as required by national policy, means that Nottinghamshire will continue to see a downward spiral of sales. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Would the council please respond to those points?
Morning. Morning, sir. Sorry about that.
Morning.
Yes, I'm happy to respond to that. The plan does use the 10-year average based on the 2007-16 data, which was the most up-to-date data available at the start of the plan period. We did, through the LAA, look at relevant need, including housing, infrastructure through the National Infrastructure Plan, and other issues, but it was felt that there wasn't significant evidence available to base any sort of uplift on that. In terms of housing, just briefly cover that first. When you look at the housing delivery test for 2019, that shows that actual completions within Nottinghamshire and Nottingham are higher than predicted. So, for example, sorry, 1 second. So they were 108% in overall, and in Nottinghamshire it was 130. In Nottingham City it was 135%. However, and using the latest housing delivery test methodology, as I understand it's been changed slightly, we still come out with higher than predicted figures. However, based on this house building, the sales, even up to the latest 2018 data, don't show a significant upturn. So we would question the kind of direct correlation between the two. In terms of covering off imports, yes, there are imports into the county predominantly from Lincolnshire. However, it's worth noting that we do from Nottinghamshire export over 60% of minerals extracted. In Lincolnshire, let me just get the figures. The imports and exports data is based on the full surveys done by the Aggregates Working Party, and the only data available is 2009, 2014 and 2018. There was a big jump between 2009 and 2014, but it's also important to note that that dropped slightly in 2018. So again, that doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that imports are kind of propping up Nottinghamshire, for want of a better term. Just looking for the figures, I won't be a second. So in terms of the actual figures, in 2009, the net exports from Lincolnshire were just over 60,000. That did increase to 258,000 in 2014, but then dropped back to 188,000 in 2018. And obviously that's a net figure because we do export a smaller amount, admittedly, but we do export to Lincolnshire. And when you look at that figure in comparison to the actual annual sales, then that's a relatively small amount from Nottinghamshire. Just going on to the East Midlands sales. Yes, elsewhere in the East Midlands, sales have gone up. We've covered this off in quite a lot of detail in our written reps already as to why we think sales have remained flat in Nottinghamshire. Just to sort of cover some of those, prior to the sort of 2008 recession, there were a number of large greenfield sites in Nottinghamshire. Since this date, they've all been worked out and haven't been replaced by sort of equally large sites. The industry presumably has been focusing on extending existing sites or working sites elsewhere. The data would suggest that in Lincolnshire that's happened. So in a sense, the drop in sales, I would argue, is more down to the industry seeking other options in terms of their portfolio. Tarmac and Lafarge were two main players in Nottinghamshire. However, over the years they've kind of merged through various forms. So that's kind of sort of provided a slight difficulty in terms of the sites they have. So I suppose they've been working relevant sites and maybe have sites that are mothballed. Tarmac have also got two mothballed sites in Nottinghamshire that haven't been worked in many years. The main one being Sturton-le-Steeple in the north of the county, which I believe has got about 7 million tonnes in it, and that got permission, I think, permission in 2008 and has yet been worked, which again if that was operational, would have increased our figures, but clearly there's industry reasons why that's not been worked. In terms of the 10-year average, many other MPAs do use the 10-year average, do base their plans on that, so it's not an unusual position to be in. And in terms of the Oxfordshire approach, one second. So in terms of the Oxfordshire approach, I understand that it was essentially done to calculate its share of national sales prior to the recession, and then that percentage was applied to the sales at the time, and that was done to address local supply issues. this could be undertaken in Nottinghamshire, but you would have to go back a significantly long way in terms of sales data. You'd have to probably go back to sort of 2006, 2007, or depending on your sort of argument, if you went back earlier than that, you would get a higher figure. So it's up for debate as to where you would actually what date you would pick. But essentially, you would be using very old data and applying that. Whether you applied that uplift to the latest figures, it's just questionable as to how far back you would go. And also looking at our sales data up to the latest 2018 data, there hasn't been a significant upturn in sales. So it's questionable whether we are now effectively in a new norm in terms of where our sales are at. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes. In our representations, we explained in more detail what we thought was happening in the county from the industry perspective, and it echoes in part the County Council's analysis, but there are significant differences. If I could respond to what Mr. Osborne James has just been saying in terms of the interaction between the two analyses, it might help to put things in perspective. He said that sites have not been replaced and that there were company mergers and the recession. These things were responsible for, and that's true. But the sites have not been replaced, he says, and that represents something which is just a commercial consideration. But it's not really. I mean, one of the things that I pointed out was that the fact that we don't have an up-to-date plan is a very significant reason why I think the industry doesn't invest or hasn't invested. It's because of the uncertainty of the large capital sums that have to be spent. That means that the industry requires the certainty of site allocations before it commits to that investment, and that's one of the reasons why sites have not been replaced and why sales have flatlined. The other thing is that even though some companies might not have replaced what they had in Nottinghamshire, that doesn't mean to say that other companies like Mick George have not wanted to come into the county but have been prevented from doing so because of the fact we can't get a site allocated in the plan. Had we been able to do that, we would have had a site up and running by now. He also mentions the mergers that happened in the industry in the middle of the last decade, and that is true. A lot of sites were mothballed, but this is exactly analogous to the Oxfordshire situation. And Oxfordshire took what we think was the reasonable position that any site which is mothballed will eventually come back into production again. Particularly if they've got a lot of reserves, and some of the mothballed sites in Nottinghamshire have indeed got significant reserves, so they will be commercially viable going into the future. So what the current policy position from the county does is ignore those mothballed sites, and what the Oxfordshire solution achieved was to incorporate them back into the mix again. By saying, well, they'll come back into production, and that ought to be taken as an indicator of future sales. And because that hasn't been done in Nottinghamshire, it just lowers the whole allocation and provision that the county is allowed, and has constrained capacity. So it's very unlikely that sales will rise with fewer sites. Once you start reducing the numbers of operational sites, then you can't increase that capacity. He also said that the 10-year average was not unusual in that a majority of local authorities use it, which is true. But as Mr. North reminded us, national policy requires us to take into account other relevant local information. And we would say the anomaly of the county flatlining sales and sites not being replaced and being mothballed is such relevant other local information. And together with the huge demand for construction that there has been and will continue to be, which is planned in adopted local plans, means that that provision has to be made. And if it isn't made in the county, it will continue to come from prolonged and increasing imports. So it's not true, as the County Council said yesterday, that Nottinghamshire seeks to plan for it to meet its own needs. It really doesn't. And it's admitted that it doesn't do that, because it's quite happy to see imports continue at quite a high level. And he said finally that there's been no upturn in sales and we must accept that as the new norm. Well, I'm afraid the industry can't accept that. Nottinghamshire has traditionally been the engine that drives sand and gravel capacity and production within the East Midlands. It's got plentiful resources and it's got a lot of potential. It's got the infrastructure there. The markets are geared up to being supplied from the county. All we are lacking really is the provision within the planning system to do that. So we have proposed that the county go back and have another look at the level of provision. And Mr. Osborne James did say that they could do the Oxfordshire approach. So we're very pleased to hear that. And in fact, we would commend that to the inquiry and suggest, sir, that you recommend that in your report.
Mr. Osborne James, can you respond to those points, please?
Yes, sir. Yes, there has been a certain amount of uncertainty with the withdrawn plan, well, the previous plan being withdrawn. However, the argument I would make against that is that at the time that our members were proposing to withdraw the plan, we did warn them that there would be a potential period of time when the industry kind of used that policy vacuum to submit planning applications for sites, and a number of the industry sort of companies had sort of mentioned to me in passing that they were ready to put in planning applications. They were simply waiting for the right time. But when the plan was withdrawn, we didn't hear a single thing and planning applications weren't put in. So I would suggest that maybe the demand wasn't there at the time, because that would have been an ideal time to put in planning applications, given the uncertainty of how long it would have taken us to prepare a new plan. In terms of not taking into account the mothballed sites, they have planning permission. They could be worked. Sturton Steeple, for example, hasn't been worked since 2008. So I would question how much we could take that into account in terms of bringing that into the actual calculations. Yes, it's got permission, so it could be worked quite quickly, but it clearly hasn't. In terms of the Oxfordshire one, I didn't say that we could do that. I was simply saying that that is an option that could be considered. I caveated that with the fact that I said that we would have to use data that would be, in our opinion, significantly out of date to apply an uplift to the latest figures, or the 2007-16 figures that the plan's based on, particularly in the light of more recent sales data that just doesn't support a significant upturn in sales. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Conway, please.
Thank you. I apologise if we drop out a little bit. We've been a bit bitty on signal here, so if I drop out, if you can't hear me, I apologise in advance. I think the issue that we've got at the minute with policy MP1 is, as worded, it appears to be a cap on sites moving forward. So you're effectively putting a maximum requirement for sand and gravel, sandstone, crushed rock on there. And the only way to increase production, as everyone's been saying, is to allow for additional units. Without the additional units, there is going to be no increase in production. The sales will effectively be flatlined. And I don't think a decline in sales is necessarily reflective or an indication of reduced demand in the county. There's been quite a bit of crossover with large production units. Finningley is a really good example of one that's moved out of the county during the 10-year sales data period, if you like, moving into South Yorkshire markets. And that site's never been replaced by anything. The sales data is influenced by recession figures, but it's also sites, that we've been saying they haven't been worked as they were originally planned to be worked. There is a large land bank held in mothballed sites. Sturton and Girton are good examples. It's not that they're not coming forward to be worked, it's just that they don't have, there isn't the ability at the minute to work them as they were originally planned. And I think Tarmac have been very open throughout the whole plan process that isn't going to be the case. They're not going to be working to the 500,000 tonnes per year at Sturton. So the reserves that are effectively land banked within those sites aren't going to be worked during the plan period. So there is a need for additional resource there. I'm not sure that enough consideration's been given to the role of Nottingham in overall supply terms, in terms of the contribution it makes to South Yorkshire and also the importance it's going to be for Leicestershire. Leicestershire at the minute have only one site that has the potential to work long term during the whole plan period. And that's providing it gets permission for the extensions that it needs. It's not an allocation within the plan. I think there needs to be some recognition as an absolute minimum that policy MP1 is identifying these figures as minimum provision figures, not maximum provision figures. And I think we'd probably argue that it was a political decision to withdraw the last plan, which it was driven to make a decision that the 10-year average sales was used to produce the new plan, and I'm not sure that's reflective of current circumstances given the amount of growth that's planned for.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Osborne James, would you respond, please?
Yes, sorry. In terms of MP1, it identifies the kind of demand that's needed over the plan period. I mean, it's important to note that point 3 of the policy does allow for sites to come forward where a need can be demonstrated. In terms of the reserves that are land banked, yes, the Sturton and Girton situation does increase our land bank significantly, but they do have planning permission and they could be worked. I was going to say tomorrow, but that wouldn't be true, would it? It would take time to set the sites up, but you know what I mean. But they could be worked relatively quickly if once the infrastructure was on site. So they are relevant, they have got planning permission and they could be worked. Leicestershire, yes, I understand that reserves are getting short in Leicestershire. However, they haven't come to us with any specific figures, and it's not the case that we would be the only county that could supply that. Lincolnshire would also be well placed to serve that market, so it's not dependent on just on Nottinghamshire to do that. It was a political decision to withdraw the plan, and that's completely within the rights of the members. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, and Mrs. Owen, please.
Thank you, sir. Just picking up a few points, you did ask a question about how we could rely on some of these other methods of calculating how much mineral was going to be required in the future. And I looked at it in the light of the Planning Officers Society's advice on how you could look at these other factors that should be taken into account beyond the 10-year average. And you'll find a list of those things which they suggested on page 9 of my original submission. Out of the 7 or 8 different things that they suggested you look at, only 2 of them could I find actual mathematical ways or factual information that we could actually point to and rely on. And those were geological resources being exhausted and the trends and forecasts of population change, including information in local plans on house building. So those 2 factors I could actually pin figures to. That doesn't mean to say the other things shouldn't be taken into account, such as planned infrastructure, etc. But those 2, we could actually put some figures to them. And in relation to Nottinghamshire, the exhaustion of the geological resources, this is the Finningley Quarry. Because in the 10-year average figures, there's information that relates to the production at Finningley going in and out of the county. And I was actually able to put a figure on that so that we could actually say the impact on the 10-year average of that situation is a particular figure. And looking at the counties, they are saying 1.7 million tonnes per annum. If you assess the impact of Finningley going in and out of the county, that rises to 1.85. The second thing that I could actually put some figures on was the house building. And I looked at that again in some detail, and you'll find that at page 16 of my submission. And at the point of time when I wrote this, we were looking at the 63% increase over the period of the 10-year rolling average to what is proposed in the future for house building. And that would increase the figure that we're looking at for the annual production to 3.02 million tonnes per annum. And you'll find that at page 16 of my assessment. So looking now at how that relates to what other people are saying, because you've got a range of figures in front of you now in terms of the annual production rate forecast. You've got the 1.7 from the County Council, which is purely based on the 10-year average. And then you've got various figures ranging from 2.32 from the MPA, which is based on Oxfordshire, up to 3.1, which is I'll call it Mick George 2. It's Mr. Radcliffe's second approach, and that's linked directly to past house building rates. He also has 2.63, and that's an interesting figure because here he's carried out statistical analysis on the relationship between house building over the past 10 years and the actual requirement for aggregate. And that comes out at a figure of 2.63. That's interesting in that it doesn't take into account the Finningley situation. So I would say it's probably very similar to the Brett Aggregates position, which is 3.02. These figures are important in that they are looking at methods by which we can say the 10-year average gives us a flat line for Nottinghamshire, but we need to look into the future and what is going to be required in the county. And the 2 issues that I picked out that I was able to quantify were the Finningley situation and the house building. So I think they're very important figures, and they are important in that they look at it over a period of time. Whereas Mr. Osborne-Jones, when he talked about house building, he was only looking at a very short period of time. We don't say that that is acceptable. We don't say that's the way forward. We say you need to look at a long period of time, and we need to look at how those two, the house building and the aggregate demand, how they interact. Also, with regard to the house building, the County Council talk about 20%. Oxfordshire, it was 35% of the total amount of aggregate required. But it's very important to note that with house building come all the other things that also use aggregates. And with now having the community infrastructure levy, it means that every house has to make a contribution financially to all the infrastructure that is needed, such as schools, hospitals, etc., so that we can say that although it might be 20 or 35% directly used in one house, overall, it's a lot higher than that. And it can be used, the house building, as a measure of the total amount of aggregate that's needed. And just one other thing, on production in the East Midlands, going back to what you've already been told, if we look at Appendix 2 of my submission, you'll see there that there is some information about how the Notts County only increased the current output in 2017 was at 40% of its 2006 output, whereas all the other counties in the East Midlands had risen to beyond that figure. And then finally is the cost of planning application. Mr. Osborne-Jones suggested that in the void between the minerals plan being withdrawn and the new plan coming out, he would have expected to have seen planning applications. With the political uncertainty in the county and the cost of those applications, which for any of these big sites is in excess of £500,000, nobody in the industry is going to put a planning application in. So that's why he hasn't seen any coming forward. And this is an important point for this plan, because if there isn't enough mineral in it, because of the political uncertainty, people won't come forward, even if there is a need. They need the certainty of having sites allocated in this plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Osborne-James.
Thank you. Yes, as Mrs. Owen put forward, there have been many different options put forward in terms of the forecast. We've set out our position as to why we think ours is appropriate, and we've already talked about housing in terms of the delivery test. And finally, I'd just like to say that we are trying to seek certainty. We are trying to get a plan in place. We've gone from having the withdrawn plan to the examination, okay, with the slight delay within a relatively quick time, I think, compared with the speed that local plans are normally prepared. So we are trying to provide certainty for the industry so that investment can take place and sites can be put forward. And that's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. North, please.
Thank you, sir. Just sort of really picking up 1 or 2 points. Firstly, the climate, as it were, and I think Mrs. Owen succinctly put it. And I've discussed this situation with members when the last plan was withdrawn a couple of weeks before the proposed examination, and it's precisely that point. There's a huge financial commitment to putting in a planning application. And some of our members have been stung in the past in putting applications in when there isn't an up-to-date local plan, and have had reversals. And that is a very serious consideration. The other thing that hasn't been really discussed is HS2. Now, the West Midlands will be contributing significantly to HS2, and the plans I know from discussing with members is that day-to-day demand in the West Midlands is going to be, well, hoped to be backfilled from the East Midlands. So I know Staffordshire contributed significantly to Nottinghamshire's demand figures by imports. I think you'll see Staffordshire's reserves halve overnight in the very near future. So there's questions about all that demand scenario around HS2 and what the impacts are going to be pulling on that. On the 10-year average, I mean, whether or not other mineral planning authorities use it exclusively doesn't make it right. National policy is very clear, and if you review minutes of aggregate working parties, you'll see me bleating on time and time again about this issue to make sure that it's registered and that it's not used as an excuse. It's very clear you cannot just rely on the 10-year average. And all the evidence you've had before you, sir, and what you've heard this morning shows that there is a significant demand on Nottinghamshire. Now, whether they provide it from within Nottinghamshire or they need imports, the fact is you need to recognise that significant demand so that either they can plan properly for it or the surrounding counties can plan properly for it. I think that's all, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Keane, you wish to come in there?
So yes, I just had a couple of points that I listening to all those various comments from the industry that I'd like Mr. Osborne James to pick up on. But I note that looking at the hands up, there's a couple more goes there, and I don't know whether I can ask the questions that I'd like. I think it'd be useful if Mr. Osborne James dealt with for you in the context of the points that have been raised, or I can wait until Mr. Ratcliffe and Mr. Mrs. Conway have gone and deal with him compendiously. I'm in your hands.
Okay. Well, shall we hear from Mr. Ratcliffe then, please?
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's just to pick up on one point at this stage that Mr. Osborne James made about provision within MP1. That the County Council are willing to look at new sites if need can be demonstrated. And the question that I would like to ask them through you, sir, would be how would they envisage that need would be established? Because if they are taking the position, as they do now, that need is solely determined by the level of sales within the county, and given that the future projection of sales is going to continue to be flat, and when looking at the delivery schedule, which I assume we're going to come on to later, it's not likely to achieve the policy level in any event, then how would an applicant demonstrate a need? Would they, for example, be able to cite rising imports, say, from Lincolnshire, and say, look, we can establish something within the county which will cut your imports from outside the county? I mean, how would the council consider in the circumstances of a much reduced capacity to actually supply the market? How would we demonstrate a need?
Okay, Mr. Osborne James, would you respond to the points made by Mr. Ratcliffe and Mr. North, please?
In terms of how need would be demonstrated, that would be down to the operator at the planning application stage to provide relevant information to justify their scheme. It would be down. I can't go into any more detail than that because they would have that information. Individual sites maybe would serve different area or have different needs. So I don't see that there's one flat example that I could give or a list of examples. They would have to make that case as part of the planning application. Sorry, I forgot Mr. North's point, if you wouldn't mind.
It was concerning the
was it
HS2
sorry, yes.
and other authorities contributing towards the demand for aggregates for that.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of HS2, in the LAA, we do make reference to it. We acknowledge that it's going to happen. However, at the moment, there aren't any exact figures as to how much it will need and exactly when it's going to happen. So unfortunately, we can't quantify that in terms of projecting forward any need. Clearly, it is going to need mineral, but there just isn't the evidence there to kind of specifically provide an uplift or take that into account fully. Thank you.
Okay, and Mrs. Conway, please. You're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, I'm back again. It's just go back to that point on need and how it could be assessed as part of a planning application, because the only thing that you could use really is by looking at the local aggregate assessment and looking at historic sales data or what the average sales are. And as we've just discussed, they're going to be flatlined without additional productive capacity within the county. You could look at import rates, but again, how regularly that's done, we're talking every 4 years, if not more, at the minute. I don't really know how you'd be able to make a judgment in terms of, or demonstrate a need to be able to bring anything forward with the policy as worded at the minute.
Mr. Osborne James, would you respond to that, please?
Yes, sir. I have seen planning applications that have put in reasons as to why there is a need. Again, it's down to the individual operator and the circumstances that they're in. I don't necessarily want to be drawn on a specific point, but in terms of examples, I could think that the operator may not have reserves in the area and that it'd have to import it. They may have operational needs that they can clearly demonstrate that would mean that that site is far more sustainable or optimal in comparison to sites they already have. So I think actually there are a number of reasons that individual operators could use to demonstrate need. It wouldn't just have to be based on the LAA. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, sir. And I apologise in advance if there's any repetition with what I'm about to say. I've listened intently with what's been said, and I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. North and Mr. Ratcliffe. Effectively about MP1 smothering supply options going forward in the county. And just to reiterate the CEMEX position, we have 2 quarries in the county, Eastleigh and Cromwell. Cromwell situation is, as officers will know, quite critical. And actually in the period of the last 2 or 3 years, we have put applications in. A large application to the north of the site for a new quarry, Cromwell North, 1.9 million tonnes, which we also promoted and hasn't found its way into the plan. We also recently put an application into the south of the quarry as an extension of 550,000 tonnes, which was approved by officers. Now, I agree with the lady about the investment that's required in bringing sites forward. The only reason we did that in the county was because of that, the desperate need to ensure continuity of supply. We will go on the next point, I'm aware, the delivery schedule, which I have a few comments on. But I would question not only the future supply, but also the baseline within the policy. We've advocated and we've made representations, but I think that's correct. I'd also like to make the point about the plan provision that I don't believe it builds in enough flexibility. Plans, as you will be well aware, in a managed aggregate supply system should be achievable and sustainable. I don't believe this plan would be. The environmental impact assessment process eliminates huge amounts of reserves. Lots of uncertainties come forward. So the allocations in the plan that have been indicated will not be achievable. We all know that. People who are involved in the plan process. So I would actually argue the plan cannot even achieve the figures it's seeking to achieve, notwithstanding the fact that we believe it's underprovided. I think there's a serious question mark over the deliverability of the plan, and therefore I believe it's unsound. Well, that's helpful, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Osborne-James, could you respond to those points, please?
I think we've covered a lot of those, so I don't have any further comments. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Keane, please.
So thank you. Mr. Osborne-James has dealt with some of the points I wanted to pick up on in the course of his answers, but there are just two matters, if I may, that I would ask him to deal with in the context of the points that have been made. And the first is in relation to the use of the 10-year average, and we know the framework refers to and other relevant information, which is a point Mr. North in particular has focused on. I just would like to ask Mr. Osborne-James to deal with whether the council has had regard to other relevant information, and also whether the council has considered alternative approaches. And the second point, so if I can deal with them together, and then Mr. Osborne-James can take them in turn, is this suggestion that MP1 operates as a cap on sites coming forward. I'll just ask him to deal with that point specifically. I'm grateful, sir.
Thank you.
So in terms of other approaches that we've taken account of, I'm just getting to the relevant section. So there are a number of other approaches that could be looked at. We could use the kind of most recent 3 or 10-year averages. Both of these figures are lower than the December 2016 figures that the plan is based on, and would result in a reduction of need. We could look at a longer plan period, so we could look at either a 12 or a 15-year period. This would take into account kind of higher sales prior to the recession, but we don't feel that this would be in line with the 10-year average as set out in the MPPF. We could link it to housing projections, which we kind of touched on earlier. However, we would be very cautious about doing this because we feel that this would be linking aggregate demand to one single factor that is actually a relatively small amount of overall demand, and there aren't necessarily any detailed figures available. We've talked about the kind of average per house, or that's been talked about, and then taking account of other infrastructure, but again, we don't feel that this is a robust methodology to forecast housing on. We could take account of imports and develop a sort of uplift based on imports. However, given that we're a significant exporter, far more than we are an importer, we don't feel that this is an approach that is practical given our situation. And we've talked about the kind of Oxfordshire plan approach earlier on. In terms of the point 1 of MP1, this is merely the forecast based on the kind of the average in the plan, and as I say, point 3 kind of allows for extensions to come forward where a need can be demonstrated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. North, please.
Yes, so just briefly, going back to what Mr. Osborne James just said, I mean, it's all. I hope you can hear me. I appear to be frozen. No, okay. It's all could. The fact is, they are just using the 10-year average. You know, they in their own LAA, and they have figures. They have, however you want to forecast it, and I accept there are different ways you can do it, as has been shown by the evidence that's been given to you, sir. The fact is, there are opportunities to forecast future demand without the necessity to going out to consultants or anything, using own published figures to come up with a sensible demand situation. On the issue of need, the concern I have, and Mr. Osborne Jones has been good enough to admit, it was clearly a political decision to withdraw the last plan. And, you know, we're not naive enough to think that politics doesn't come into planning. But that is the climate that we're now operating in. And the withdrawal of that plan was, the reason for that was a drop in the 10-year average. It was a cynical decision to do that. And we're now operating in that climate, that political climate. Now, if it's not very clear in the plan how need will be addressed, then, you know, I have concerns about relying on political decisions in Nottinghamshire to properly consider that issue. That's all, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I'd just like to remind the inquiry about planning guidance, paragraph 27064, which talks about the 10-year average supply. And it says that local aggregate assessments must also consider relevant local information, other relevant local information, in addition to the 10-year rolling supply, which seeks to look ahead at possible future demand rather than rely on past sales. And what we have is a situation where the county council say that's impossible, we cannot do that, we're entirely relying on what's gone on during 10 years of intense recession and uncertain planning situation and commercial decisions which are adversely caused as a result of that. So there is no forward-looking element to this plan at all in terms of its provision level, which is contrary to national policy and national guidance. And I'd urge you, sir, to report that the county council must go back and look at it again to include a proper forward-looking forecast in their analysis of provision. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Winkley of Lincolnshire County Council, you'd like to come in there?
Yes, thank you, sir. I was going to make some comments on this in terms of my representations for Lincolnshire County Council, but this seems an opportune time to actually raise it. I mean, in response to Nottinghamshire County Council's comments on question 28 of the supplementary questions, they had actually sought to justify using the 10-year average after considering and dismissing 4 alternatives, which Mr. Osborne James has just outlined in his response. So I would just like to make a few comments on those 4 alternatives. The first one was the potential use of the 3-year average sales figures. And it was pointed out that the average 3 years are similar to the average 10 years. Therefore, they don't form a basis for indicating any increase in demand. But I think that argument is flawed in this particular case because the 3-year average also does not take into account the amount of imports. So in some respects, it suffers from the same problem as the 10-year average. So in this particular case, it's not helpful whatsoever. The second scenario that was considered was using a longer period of average sales, which at least was a step in the right direction. But they then dismissed that approach fairly quickly by saying that pointing out the risks of using historic data. In doing that, they don't actually consider the very significant risks of ignoring very high amounts of imports into the county. So really, dismissing one risk while introducing another isn't really an acceptable approach either. The third approach was to looking at linking demand with the housing programme projections. Now, I appreciate it's quite a complex relationship between sand and gravel sales and housing projections, but they've actually linked it to sales in the county. Now, the problem with doing that, they're only looking at sales from sand and gravel extracted in the county. The reality is, demand is at least partly met from imports from Lincolnshire. So again, the arguments that because sales didn't rise during a period of higher housing completions is flawed because they haven't taken into account those imports. On the fourth point they've raised is about potentially making an uplift to the 10-year baseline. But this is largely dismissed because they're pointing out that information on imports is only available in limited surveys, i.e. the 2009, 2014 and 2000 and put my glasses on. 2018 surveys. Now, the problem with doing that is that they're saying that we don't have information for the other survey years, therefore we can't assume that Lincolnshire has been exporting large amounts of sand and gravel into Nottinghamshire during those years. Well, I would say that in intervening years, we still carry out surveys. In Lincolnshire, we divide production into 3 production zones, and it's only Lincoln Trent Valley production zone which has seen significant increases in sales over and above the planned amount. Also, on top of that, we do know that quarries in Nottinghamshire on that side of the boundary have been mothballed. So on the balance of probabilities, there's good reason to suspect that exports into Nottinghamshire have been maintained throughout the period. So that's my response to the four issues raised by Nottinghamshire in terms of alternatives.
Okay, thanks. And Osborne James, would you like to?
Yes, just a couple of points. The LAA does take account of future infrastructure schemes. As I mentioned earlier, we look at the National Infrastructure Plan, and we look at other likely projects coming forward. In the past, that's included the net tram extension, other road schemes. So they've been looked at in the past. So the LAA does take account, does look forward, and does assess any or do its best to identify and assess infrastructure schemes coming forward. Just a couple of points on the Lincolnshire response. The 3 and 10-year averages, they are what they are. They assess the sales average. They don't take account of imports, and I'm not sure quite how they would do, to be honest. And in terms of the data that's available, we use the national survey data, which is only done on, as sort of in recent times, only be done on those 3 years. So that's what we rely on to ensure that we get a comparable survey across the East Midlands. That's all I'd like to say. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now would be an opportune time, I think, maybe to hear Lincolnshire County Council's representations and comments that you wish to make to this hearing. So would Mr. Winkley, would you like to go on that?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I think a lot of the points I've already just covered in my last response to the question, and I don't want to particularly go through our case again, which is all set out. But there are a couple of extra points I would like to raise. I know that in the response to question number 28 of the supplementary questions, there is reference in paragraph 25 to the fact that Nottinghamshire has historically been and continues to be a large exporter of sand and gravel, which is clearly true. And prior to the recession, Nottinghamshire was the most important producer of sand and gravel in the East Midlands. During that time, they did export very significant quantities of material, as you would expect under the managed aggregate supply system, particularly into places like South Yorkshire, which don't have their own indigenous supplies of sand and gravel. Also, before the recession, there were cross-boundary movements of sand and gravel between Nottinghamshire and Lincolnshire, but they largely balanced out. However, what's changed since the recession with the mothballing of quarries is that they are now importing large quantities of sand and gravel from Lincolnshire. So the balance has completely changed. They keep referring their statements to the fact that they've reached some sort of steady supply of sand and gravel post-recession. Well, they have, but it's propped up by imports from Lincolnshire, and that is not a sustainable approach to planning. Also, just as a final point, where we've been discussing need and why there may potentially be need for additional quarries over those allocated, one major factor that will be taken into account in any application will be the size of the land bank. And unfortunately, because of the way they calculate the land bank by using the 10-year average, it will have the effect of actually inflating that land bank. So it's going to put any operator, any applicant on the back foot when they make an application within that county for a new quarry. Okay, thank you. That's all I've got to say.
Okay. And Mr. Osborne James, would you respond?
Yes. Can I just have a moment? I'm just writing some notes down, and then I'll get back to you if that's all right.
Yeah.
Literally won't be a second. Sorry about that. In terms of Lincolnshire stating that by the imports they're propping up our sales figures, if you actually look at the figures in 2009, Nottinghamshire sales were 1.27 million tonnes, and the net imports were just over 60,000 tonnes. 2014, Nottinghamshire sales were 1.43 million, the imports 258,000, the net imports, and then in 2018 sales were 1.56 million tonnes, and the net imports were 188,000. I would argue that that's not a significant amount, and compared with sales prior to the recession, they are somewhat below that. So whilst clearly the imports are being used in Nottinghamshire, they're certainly not supporting or creating an uplift that is making up for the loss that we saw after 2008. In terms of the land bank, the methodology used is the standard approach. There's not much more I can say about that. That's the standard approach that is stated. The number of mothballed sites does increase the land bank, but they're permitted reserves, and the land bank is the permitted reserves. So there's nothing much more to say on our methodology of how to calculate the land bank. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Daly, would you like to come in there?
Thank you, sir. Just one small point in response to Mr. Osborne James's comment. He's quite correct that 2018 there was about 250,000 tonnes of material passing through from Lincolnshire to Nottinghamshire. However, there is a category of unknown in the East Midlands of material that's exported from Lincolnshire, and that is 575,000 tonnes. Now, on the balance of probability, I would expect that a significant proportion of that also went into Nottinghamshire. So, whilst it can't categorically be proved that's the case, it is something that needs to be borne in mind, that that 250,000 tonnes is not necessarily the entire output from Lincolnshire to Nottinghamshire. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. One of the questions you did ask was about cross-boundary movements between quarries located in the Trent Valley, either side of the Nottinghamshire-Lincolnshire border. And I know what Lincolnshire said about that. I think from an industry perspective, the Lincoln market, or might consider central Lincolnshire, is served from the Trent Valley sites within the county, and they're fairly self-contained. There's a little bit of material goes down the A46 into Nottinghamshire and to other places, but traditionally that hasn't been the case. It might, of course, with these increased imports, be a lot more now. But speaking traditionally in terms of the market, the Lincoln sites, the Lincoln market, the sites in the Newark area are really orientated to the A1 corridor. And again, I'm speaking in as a traditional market scenario. A lot of the material went into South and even into West Yorkshire. Some of it also went down the A46 toward the A52 and Nottingham. But again, traditionally, there were a lot of sites in the Nottingham area which served that market. So again, the traditional orientation of the market in the Newark area was north-south. That has obviously changed somewhat. The mothballing of sites in the Newark area and the supply as well of Nottingham not coming from that area, but probably all coming from East Derbyshire and North Leicestershire. It's all been mixed up a lot more in the recent past, and really what we've got at the moment is a distortion. Those sites either side of the county boundary in the Trent Valley could quite happily serve their own traditional markets if there were enough of them. But the fact is that there's not enough on the Nottinghamshire side for various reasons. And as Mr. Winkley pointed out, the surplus has had to be supplied from the Lincolnshire side. I'd also like to point out that my guess would be that, although I don't know for sure, but my guess would be that the Lincolnshire imports are being carried out by companies who have not mothballed sites in Nottinghamshire. In other words, it's a response of the market to the demand of each individual company. If a company cannot source to a particular concrete plant for a particular town in Nottinghamshire from a local site, it's going to go to the next nearest site it can supply from. And if that next nearest site is in Lincolnshire, then it will go to Lincolnshire. And the solution to that dilemma, and in sustainability terms, to make it more sustainable, is to allow that company to dig material from closer to the market that it's actually serving. So what's driven all this complicated interboundary movements of aggregates is purely the availability of sites to the industry. And the ideal situation would be for every interested party who has in the industry that has an economic plant within a particular area is to have a local source of supply. And that is really at the root of it. And it's our inability as an industry to get those sites established, which has caused this problem. And the county council's solution to it, well, they're just ignoring really the fact that it's there. To them, it's not a problem. To them, it's sales are everything, but sales do not tell the whole picture. It's a very inadequate way of trying to measure demand. In fact, I would say you cannot determine demand purely from past sales. It's impossible to do that. You have to take into account a lot of other considerations, including commercial ones. And the fact that that's not been done is a great shame. And it will, if this is allowed to go forward, it will decimate the industry within the county for years and years to come.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Osborne-James, would you respond, please?
Sorry for the delay. I think we've covered most of those issues off, so I don't have any further comments to make. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Mrs. Owen, please.
Thank you, sir. Just to add some further information regarding the loss of capacity in the county, I think it's worth noting that in the South Nottinghamshire area, the Home Pierpoint Quarry closed in 2004 and the Hoveringham Quarry in 2008. And between them, at their peak, they were delivering almost 1 million tonnes per annum into the market. Originally, a new quarry at Gunthorpe would have replaced the lost capacity, 750,000 tonnes per annum of it, but the planning permission was refused. And that capacity has never been replaced. And it must be having some major impact on these figures that we're looking at now.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rees.
Hello, sir. Yeah, I've been with interest sort of listening to the debate, and I think what Jenny has just stated, I think, is a very material point. That the closure of Home Pierpoint and Hoveringham without a replacement site coming forward. She did say that the site was refused. I don't think actually the site was refused. I think the application couldn't be agreed and was withdrawn just at the same time that Tarmac and Lafarge merged together. So I think it suited them to not have that site come forward when Tarmac and Lafarge controlled much of the Trent Valley. And that productive capacity being taken out of the market has had a dramatic effect on the overall sales. And I think that's something that I think has been reiterated a few times by Mr. Ratcliffe, that when you've got a number of major conglomerates who control the majority of the market, it's very difficult for anybody else to come into that market, especially when the market is dictated by sites that are dormant, you know, in terms of the overall sales. I'm sure if the Sturton-le Steeple site of 7 million tonnes had been located near Nottingham, it wouldn't be dormant. It's just a function of its location and the market. So I think from that perspective, those considerations need to be taken into account. I think the other thing as well, I think that the constant reference to looking back, and I think this is a common problem with plans, we always look back, we never look forward. And I think in Nottinghamshire, it's clear the drive for economic development is in the greater Nottingham area, in the southern and southwestern part of the county, and that's been reiterated by the recent publication of the Greater Nottingham Strategic Plan as a consultation document, which is one of your on the library. I think that's very interesting, showing a substantial amount of areas where Nottingham is a city and an area. I would call it the tier 3 Kovid zone now. That's what it is. That's where all of the development and growth is noted. And in addition to the growth options plan, which is figure 2.8 in that document, there is the HS2 development potentially at Toton and all the development around junction 24, 25 of the M1, and everything is being sucked into the southwestern part of the county, and yet a substantial amount of the historical reserves now that are still permitted are all located in the eastern and northern part of the county, which are not going to supply those markets. So we need sites located nearer to where the main demand is going to be. And looking forward to the actual growth strategies for both Nottingham City and the council, it's quite clear that everything is focused around the Greater Nottingham area and the M1 corridor. And if HS2 does come forward, as it may well do, then that is clearly going to have a massive impact during the plan period up until 2036 on demand for aggregate. So I just wanted to make those points about the not just the provision that's been made, but also the future demand and where that growth in the county is going to come from.
Okay, thank you.
Sir.
And Mr. Osborne James, would you reply, please, to those points?
Yes, so the plan, as we mentioned quite a number of times yesterday, aims to provide a geographical spread of sites across the county, and this spread aims to deal with the issues of the markets. Clearly, there's the sort of Greater Nottingham market, which has just been mentioned, and obviously there is the allocation in the south of the county, but we also can't ignore the other areas of the county in terms of the minerals can only be worked where they're found. So in the Newark area, obviously there are allocations there, and then also in the northern, the Idle Valley in the north of the county, which still supplies the South Yorkshire region. So really the point is that the plan aims to make a spread of sites across the county to deal with these issues based on the availability of the mineral in those where it can be found. That's all I'd like to say.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Mrs. Owen, please.
Yes, sir. Just to support what Mr. Rees said, you'll recall yesterday I pointed out in my evidence on page 21 where we have an assessment of the spread of the house building and the spread of the aggregate proposals. And for the south of the county, 56% of the housing for Nottinghamshire is proposed, whereas taking into account permissions and allocations, only 18% of the aggregate is proposed.
Okay, thank you. Do you wish to come back on that that last point, Mr. Osborne James?
No, I think we've covered that earlier. Thank you.
Okay. I suggest that we take a break now. Can we adjourn until 11:45, please? And then after that, we can discuss policy MP2. Thank you.
This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/staywell. Children up to year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter.
My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action to investigate and deal with them, deploying extra testing capacity if we need to, or contact tracing as appropriate. The plan also deals with how we will continue to provide support for people who are made vulnerable because they need to self-isolate, and we'll be doing that through our community support hub. And we'll refine the plan as we go along to reflect the latest best practice and the information which government will be providing to the council. Finally, I want to acknowledge the lengths to which so many people and organisations have gone to already in recent months to stick with the guidance, to maintain social distancing of 2 metres wherever possible, to wash your hands thoroughly and frequently, to stay at home if you or someone in your household has symptoms, to get tested and to follow the advice that you receive when you get the result. By observing the guidance, you're protecting not only your own life and livelihood, that of your friends and also your loved ones, but also that of people you may never meet, but people who you're depending on and whom we must each depend as well. Your role in that is critical. Thank you for your help to contain the virus. My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action to investigate and deal with them, deploying extra testing capacity if we need to, or contact tracing as appropriate. The plan also deals with how we will continue to provide support for people who are made vulnerable because they need to self-isolate, and we'll be doing that through our community support hub. And we'll refine the plan as we go along to reflect the latest best practice and the information which government will be providing to the Council. Finally, I want to acknowledge the lengths to which so many people and organisations have gone to already in recent months to stick with the guidance, to maintain social distancing of 2 metres wherever possible, to wash your hands thoroughly and frequently, to stay at home if you or someone in your household has symptoms, to get tested and to follow the advice that you receive when you get the result. By observing the guidance, you're protecting not only your own life and livelihood, that of your friends and also your loved ones, but also that of people you may never meet, but people who you're depending on and whom we must each depend as well. Your role in that is critical. Thank you for your help to contain the virus. My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action to investigate and deal with them, deploying extra testing capacity if we need to, or contact tracing as appropriate. The plan also deals with how we will continue to provide support for people who are made vulnerable because they need to self-isolate, and we'll be doing that through our community support hub. And we'll refine the plan as we go along to reflect the latest best practice and the information which government will be providing to the Council. Finally, I want to acknowledge the lengths to which so many people and organisations have gone to already in recent months to stick with the guidance, to maintain social distancing of 2 metres wherever possible, to wash your hands thoroughly and frequently, to stay at home if you or someone in your household has symptoms, to get tested and to follow the advice that you receive when you get the result. By observing the guidance, you're protecting not only your own life and livelihood, that of your friends and also your loved ones, but also that of people you may never meet, but people who you're depending on and whom we must each depend as well. Your role in that is critical. Thank you for your help to contain the virus.
This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/staywell. Children up to Year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze, and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter. This winter, more than ever, with COVID-19 still circulating, we need help to reduce all avoidable risks. You can help protect the NHS, social care and loved ones by getting the flu vaccine. You may be eligible for the free vaccine at your GP or local pharmacy if you are over 65, pregnant or have a long-term condition. Find out if you are eligible at nhs.uk/stay well. Children up to Year 7 can get the free nasal spray at school or through their GP if they are below school age. If you are not eligible for the free vaccine, you can pay for it at your local pharmacy. The flu vaccination does not give you flu. It reduces the risk of catching flu as well as spreading it to others. If you had the vaccination in the past, that will not protect you as the flu strain changes every year, so you need to have a new one this year. It is also important to wash your hands often with warm water and soap. Use tissues when you cough or sneeze, and bin used tissues as quickly as possible. Thank you for helping to protect yourself and loved ones this winter. This winter.
My name's Jonathan Gribbin. I'm the Director of Public Health for Nottinghamshire County, and I'd like to tell you about the COVID-19 Local Outbreak Control Plan for Nottinghamshire. It's all about containing the virus so that we can protect one another, safeguard our critical services, and enable our schools, our workplaces, our communities to flourish again. And the plan describes how we will do that in Nottinghamshire. It complements the national test and trace arrangements, and it builds on local arrangements with key partners like Public Health England, the district and borough councils, the city council and our local NHS. It identifies a range of settings such as schools, workplaces, universities, care homes and so on, which require specific plans to deal with any fresh outbreaks of the virus. It describes how we'll be monitoring on a daily basis to spot if there are any new outbreaks, and then coordinating action.
COVID-19 is in our communities and the number of cases is on the rise. So it's essential that we each play our part in full by following all of the government guidance. Only by doing this can we keep our schools and businesses open. If you're young and healthy, you may feel the virus isn't a threat to you. But someone more vulnerable to coronavirus than you, perhaps someone closer to you than you realise, is depending on you to play your part in breaking the chain of transmission. So I'm asking everyone to do their bit. Stick to the rule of 6 for gatherings indoors or outdoors. Wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. Wear a face covering in enclosed spaces. Observe social distancing of 2 metres or 1 metre plus precautions where 2 metres really isn't possible. Follow all of the guidelines about car sharing. If you have symptoms, self-isolate and get a free test immediately. If we work together on this, we can control the spread of the virus. Thank you.
Hello, the hearing is resumed. I think Mr. Ratcliffe, do you want to say something?
Yes, so you mentioned just before the break you were going to move on to MP2, but I note that we haven't discussed the delivery schedule yet. I don't know whether you feel you have enough information on that and you don't need to.
No, good point. Okay, well, would you like to make your points about the delivery schedule now then, please?
Yes, I mean, they're essentially very, very simple. We're grateful for the County Council for putting in clarify a number of issues. As far as we can see, it shows that at no time during the plan period will the policy provision level be met by the forecast outputs of each site. It just all falls short. Lest the County Council say, well, in that case, then we can go to the planning permission level. That will increase it. It does go above then the policy provision level for about 8 years. The essential difference between the two scenarios is, as we pointed out in the charts we produced, it's entirely down to Sturton Steeple. And the very large difference between the forecast output and the permitted output. Now, that raises a number of issues. One is that if there is a significant rise in demand in the Nottingham area, clearly Sturton will not be able to supply that market. So it would only benefit the South Yorkshire market and North Nottinghamshire. It wouldn't benefit any other part of the county. So what we're really saying is that the demand inherent within the other parts of the county is really not sufficient as it's been made in the plan. The other point that I make is that clearly with the way that the County Council have allocated mineral largely into big sites. Now the three big sites where all the reserves are Sturton, Langford and Girton, and they represent something like 75 to 80% of all reserves, and that position doesn't really change with plan allocations either. So what we've got is a monopoly position. All the other sites are relatively short-lived, so that by the end of the plan period, we've really got just 2 or 3 sites which are going to continue in operation with long-lived reserves. All the other sites are going to go out of production. So we've got a monopoly situation. We've got an element of mineral which will be permitted or it's allocated, which will not be and is not intended to be worked within the plan period, but which goes towards the provision level, and that surely must be wrong. What's provided for in policy should surely be available to be worked during the plan period. Now, I'm sure the County Council will come back and say, well, it is there because any mineral which would be left over at the end of the plan period could be worked by means of a higher output at a particular site during the plan period. But we really have to look again at the delivery schedule and the maximum permitted rates at which sites can be worked. And we also have to consider the intentions of the operator. If an operator has applied for mineral reserves, which they intend should last 30 years, they're not really going to be running them out in a much shorter time for a short-term benefit. So it's inadequate in many ways. And the final point I'd like to make is that national policy requires that MPAs should not allow land banks to be crowded into very few sites, which would constrain competition. And as a representative of an SME, I'm sure other members in a similar position in this forum will testify. We often get a very bad deal in the sense that we have a hand-to-mouth existence, and we don't often get the certainty of long-term security, and that's the case in this county. And I know at this point, this is obviously one of the concerns of the government, as mentioned in the white paper, still out for consultation, which mentioned this is a problem with house builders, and one of their intentions in the new planning bill is apparently that they will try and require some sites to have a spread, housing sites. This is to have a spread of house builders to give smaller companies a chance to compete in the market. And it's a similar situation in aggregates too. There are an increasing number of counties which are monopolies or near monopolies, and the smaller operators are increasingly being squeezed out. And that's what's happened here, because the county council, for one reason or another, and I'm not saying they've done it deliberately, but for one reason or another, they have preferred the big, large extensions, which give a lot of certainty to them. They solve their problems in just a few sites, but it leaves the rest of us out on a limb. And eventually, what will happen in the next 10 or 15 years is that Nottinghamshire will be a single company county, and that should be avoided. That's not good planning. It's not good sustainability, because what it will mean is that the companies who are squeezed out will, as I've said earlier in this session, just go to the next nearest available supply to them, which will probably be an adjacent county, and they will import materials. So what this will mean is even higher imports in the future. So
okay, thank you. Mr. Osborne James, there was a few points made there concerning the sand and gravel delivery schedule.
Yes.
And other points. Could you respond to those, please?
Yes, sir, not a problem. So the intention of the delivery schedule was to show a sort of strategic overview, for want of a better term, of the interaction between the permitted sites, extensions to those sites, and then how the new allocation or the new greenfield sites would combine to provide provision over the plan period. Various sort of data has been used to populate that, which has included some data from directly from the industry, planning application information, and any other information that was publicly available. The difficulty all the time with that is the sort of confidentiality element. So it was pulled together with those various bits of data. So it was never intended to act as a mathematical kind of schedule to total up each of the years and over the plan period. As mentioned, there is a difficulty with the Sturton and Girton sites. They have planning permission, and they've had planning permission for many years, and they've got a set amount that they can extract on an annual basis. The relevant operator has indicated that that is much lower, but at the same time they're arguing that more sites are needed, and they've put forward sites. So there's always going to be a difficulty between what those sites can actually work, the rates that they can be worked at, and then the difficulty of kind of the operators sort of promoting other sites. And that's why those two figures are in there. We think that the permitted tonnage is the most appropriate, because clearly it couldn't happen tomorrow. But if the infrastructure is in place, then that could be worked. And the figures put forward by the industry, I'm sure they've got evidence to support that. But for the sort of certainty element, we feel that the permitted tonnages are the suitable figures to use. And by using those permitted figures, if you do go through the exercise of adding it up at the bottom, we do meet our demand till a significant time into the plan period. So that's the situation with those permitted sites. In terms of over the plan period, then obviously the plan will be monitored and reviewed through the LAA in terms of sales, and the 3-year average indicating if sales are going up, which could trigger a review. And then obviously the plans have to be reviewed on a 5-yearly basis anyway, and going forward with the white paper and the new system coming into planning system coming into place, then that's likely to play into this. The delivery schedule as well, never intended to try and forecast when demand would happen. So, for example, if there's low demand early in the plan period, then those sites might not be working at the rates that the figures in that schedule indicate. And then therefore, if demand increases in the future, then you have got that element of flexibility in there. So it's the delivery schedule really is a static representation of what might happen, or how the sites will come online, not necessarily how demand or lack of demand actually play into the figures. Moving on to the land bank issue, in a sense, we can't really do much about the element of sort of the land bank being influenced by single operators. The land bank is representative of the planning permissions that are in place. I would openly admit I quite agree that it is skewed by the large Sturton Steeple quarry and the Girton one, but unfortunately we can't really influence the land bank for the reasons I've said. And in terms of the competition issue, I take the point, but again, the plan has to look at sites that are realistic, achievable and deliverable. In terms of the extensions that were put forward, they were basically the only extensions put forward, so they happened to be large sites. There wasn't a great deal of choice in that element, and it's very difficult for the Mineral Planning Authority to sort of get involved in competition issues and whether you pick sites based on who the operator is a difficult balance to achieve. So I can't really comment too much on trying to kind of level out the playing field in terms of competition, because that's somewhat outside of the plan's scope really. I think that's all the points covered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Kelly, please.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to bring you back to point 29 as well. Just picking up on the Cromwell quarry point I raised earlier in terms of this schedule. I agree with Mr. Osborne James is saying that it's not designed to accurately forecast demand. It's just one scenario. I understand that, but the baseline is very important. The baseline establishes how many sites may need to come forward in the plan going forward. Now, just looking at the Cromwell site, post 2020 in this schedule, it assumes that CEMEX have 1.3 million tonnes of permitted reserve remaining. Now, that is not the case, which I'll get to in a moment. It also, in policy MP1, alludes to the fact that at the beginning of the planned period, we had 2.4 million tonnes Again, this goes to the heart of what I said earlier about plan flexibility. Things change all the time. Quarrying companies review their reserves annually, and we have reviewed our reserves, and unfortunately they've gone downwards annually over the last 3 or 4 years, and the reserve position is quite different than alluded to in this table. When we submitted the planning application last year, November last year, Cromwell South, we informed...
Sorry, Mr. Kelly, can I just... the sound quality is not that great.
I'm sorry. I'll come nearer to the microphone.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, yes.
Okay, I'll shout. As I say, in November 19, we submitted an application, Cromwell South. Within that, we informed the planning authority that we had just under 200,000 tonnes of reserve left under our plant site at Cromwell, and for just under 500,000 tonnes of reserve. I can inform you, sir, that the situation is now critical. We have basically just the 550,000 tonnes recently permitted to work at the site plus the plant site area. So in fact, the reserve position is significantly less than portrayed in this table. That's largely, sir, as I said, because of forecasts.
Is this tape? Sorry, is this? Are you referring to policy MP2 there?
I'm referring to policy MP2. I'm also referring to the delivery schedule in Appendix 1.
Yes.
And I've made representations on this.
Yes, I would just. There is a modification. The council has put forward a modification, which is PM 28 in the schedule of modifications, and that deletes those tonnages from policy MP2.
Okay, thank you.
But yes, please continue.
That's fine, thank you. I wasn't aware of that, but thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Mrs. Conway.
Thank you. It's not the intention of Tarmac to stifle any competition. I think that they have been very open from the start of the plan making process that the site is unable to work at the tonnages that they put forward. It's a bit like Mr. Kelly was saying in terms of consolidating reserves. They've looked at it operationally, and the constraints are that it can't be worked more than we're saying 100,000 tonnes per year. So we're actually advocating that there is a need for additional sites to come forward.
Okay, thank you. And Mrs. Owen, please.
Yes, sir. Just for your information, my response to your supplementary questions, I did append a table where I've taken the delivery schedule and put in it the figures that have been advised by the operators. I don't know anything about those figures because I'm not actually operating in the county, and neither are my clients, but it's just there for information. And it does demonstrate, as Mr. Radcliffe said, that actually at no point under these circumstances will the operations deliver the 1.7 million tonnes per annum which the county are planning for. And just a further point is, Mr. Osborne-Jones has just said that it's not possible for him to deal with sites being tied up, large sites being land banks being tied up in with a very few sites. Now, MPPF paragraph 207.g, it actually says that part of the process has to be that planning authorities should ensure that large land banks bound up in very few sites do not stifle competition. That's actually national policy. And it is possible for Nottinghamshire County Council to deal with this, and that is to allocate some more sites. It may go beyond what they think they need to plan for based on the 10-year average, but this is a very good reason. It's national policy, and it's what he should be doing. And if he hasn't done it, then I'm afraid that the plan is unsound. And also, just one further point, in the site selection methodology assessment, there are sites there which have been discounted for not environmental reasons, but for reasons, for example, the Shelford site was discounted solely on the basis that it wouldn't comply with the objective of maintaining a geographical spread of mineral sites across the county. If you've got to allocate some more sites to comply with national policy, that shouldn't preclude you allocating that site, or indeed other sites that he has. He has in front of him several sites that could be allocated, and he's chosen not to because of the small amount of land bank that he's calculated. This point is that he should be allocating further sites.
Mr. Osborne James, would you respond to that, please?
I'd just like to point out that it's not me that is allocating these, it's the county council that is allocating the sites. Just a minor point there. In terms of going back slightly, one point that I wanted to make is that there is an element of flexibility included in the plan, because the allocations that are identified have an additional 600,000 tonnes, or total an additional 600,000 tonnes above the identified shortfall of 14.8 million tonnes. So that's worth noting. Also, 2 of the allocated quarries go beyond the plan period, and the totals that are beyond the plan period is 3.36 million tonnes. So again, if there's a significant increase in demand, those sites could actually bring forward that output. And also, there's been an extension to Cromwell Quarry, which was mentioned earlier, which adds an additional 550,000 tonnes, which is outside of the plan assumptions. So there is an element of flexibility there. In terms of the land bank, we deal with the land bank represents the permitted reserves. So currently, the land bank is a factual record, and it is influenced by the sites that we have. Going forward, that'll change as sites are worked out and new sites are permitted. So the land bank will constantly change. It's not fixed. So I would still argue that there's a limited scope to change that land bank at present. In terms of the Shelford site, I'm not sure whether we're kind of talking about sites that aren't allocated in the plan, but that one of the key reasons why that wasn't allocated was due to its size, in terms of how that would interact with the demand forecast over the plan period, in that if you had that site, it would dominate the reserves all in one site. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Kelly, please.
Sorry, sir, I just left my hand up from last time. I didn't have an point to make.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Mrs. Conway, please. You're on mute at the moment.
Sorry, I'm not very good at that, am I? It might tie in with go to policy MP2, but it's how the forecasting is done later in the plan period. So when sites or extensions or allocations are worked, then the scenario longer term and how that fits into overall delivery across the whole plan period, not just the start.
So you're sort of questioning how that exercise has been carried out?
I think it's more how the council are proposing with the sites that they've allocated, and has shown the delivery of sites going through the plan period. You get to a point sort of mid-2020s where everything starts dropping off, where a lot of sites are due to close. And then it's how is that to be dealt with as a plan review or reviewing local aggregates assessment? How does the plan provide for what happens longer term during the plan period?
we did briefly cover this earlier in terms of the plan will be monitored and reviewed through the LAA through the 3-year average in terms of any signs of uptake, and also the plan will be reviewed every 5 years anyway, so it will be a review, a monitor and review process.
Mrs. Conway, did you want to make another?
I just wanted to emphasise the issue with delivery times for new sites coming on stream and the amount of time that takes. You've got an average of probably about 5 years lead-in time for new sites coming forward.
Okay, and Mr. Ratcliffe, please.
Yes, so just responding to what the County Council been saying. When you allocate sites which are long rather than broad, by which I mean long-lived, rather than the full amount of requirement in terms of capacity, you end up with something which is not really meeting the needs of the industry or of the community. Once you've determined a demand level and calculated an annual provision rate multiplied by the years of the plan period, if you don't take any account of when that material is going to be available, and you choose long-lived sites, then you're inevitably going to be in a position where you don't meet the full provision level, which is what we've got here. And what they should have done, as Mrs. Owens said, was allocate more sites, more capacity in the short term in order to counteract the material which Mr. Osborne James admits is probably not going to be worked during the plan period. It's not really sufficient for the County Council to say, well, that material is permitted or will be permitted, and therefore it will be available to be worked. But that's going against what the industry has indicated its market is likely to be. Now, in that there's an increase in demand, yes, there will be a small scale increase all around amongst all the operators. Everybody benefits from an increased demand. It's unrealistic and naive to suggest that when a particular site or sites drop off the schedule because they're worked out, all of the demand which they cater for will be reallocated to the remaining sites. It just doesn't work that way. That's not commercial reality. What happens, as I said in my representations, and at the risk of repeating myself too much and labouring the point, what happens is that operators will want to keep their market share if they can't work locally, and they will import material, or they'll find other ways of trying to meet the demand. The market share will not pass over to the remaining sites. So inevitably what's going to happen in this scenario is that as the shorter lived sites drop off the schedule and we're left with fewer sites which are longer lived, the capacity to deliver material into the market will also fall at the same rate. That is inevitable. And we can say that with some certainty, because that is what has happened over the last 30 odd years in places like the Southeast, which has gone down probably to about 25-30% of what historically they produced. And that was a deliberate policy decline, in the sense that in the Southeast historically a lot of material went into London, and now virtually no material from the Southeast goes into London, or very few. London is mainly satisfied by marine aggregates and by crushed rock. So the home counties are left to serve their own markets, and what was required of them in the past is no longer required. But what it has meant is that the numbers of sites, as the numbers of sites have declined, there just hasn't been the capacity to deliver, and we're now in the situation countrywide where sand and gravel, in our view, is at a critical point, because as that capacity declines, we cannot increase the sales significantly. And there was a situation nationally between at least 2014 and 2016 when house building rates went through the roof. But when excuse me, but when nationally sand and gravel sales flatlined, it just didn't have the capacity to respond to the demand, and that will happen here in this county unless this is addressed. And the solution to that, to the fact that reserves have been permitted in the long term at a few sites, is, as has already been suggested, for more sites to be allocated. And although that may end up with a larger quantum than what the County Council has determined is absolutely necessary, what it does is deliver flexibility and enables the production capacity and the ability to be able to deliver the forecast policy level of output to be achieved.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Osborne James, do you wish to respond to those points?
No, thank you. I think I've covered off most of those previously. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Well, we have started to go on to policy MP2. Are there any further comments that people wish to make with regard to policy MP2? Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I just had an opportunity to look at the MP28 modification that you referred me to, and quite simply, all it does is just correct the discrepancy. But the fact of the matter is, there's still an underlying discrepancy with the baseline information that feeds into MP2. Just wanted to just bring that to your attention.
Okay, so even though the figures have been deleted, they still illustrate the information that's justifying the policy.
Yes, of course. So that effectively the policy is unachievable because it allocates reserve that doesn't actually exist.
Okay, Mr. Osborne James, your comments, please.
So with policy MP2, the original intention of putting the original data in MP2 was based on the baseline figure of December 2016, and so at that point in time that data was correct. Obviously, as previously mentioned, reserves are reviewed annually, biannually, whatever rate, but we can't simply amend the figures in policy MP2 because you would never reach a fixed point because you'd be forever changing it through the plan period. Obviously, with this policy, we tried, as sites that were allocated got permission, we tried to update sort of 1A of that policy, and through the written reps that have been made, we tried to explain that, and ultimately that's why we came to the modification that we put forward in terms of removing the data, the tonnages out of 1A, because it was clear that it was causing confusion as people were trying to calculate various things from that. So we feel that by getting rid of that, that does clarify the position, and that policy is sound. Thank you.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes, thank you to Mr. Osborne James, but the fact of the matter remains, of course, that this forms the basis of the sites that have been allocated in the plan going forward. And the result is there isn't enough sites being put forward. It's quite simple to me. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further comments on policy MP2? No. Okay. Well, thank you for all your inputs, and if we can adjourn for lunch now and return at 2 o'clock, please. And the next session is looking specifically at the site allocation MP2P, which is Mill Hill near Button and Fabis. And then the latter part of the afternoon is looking at the other minerals provision policies MP3 to MP11. Okay, so if we can adjourn then, please, and come back at 2 o'clock. Thank you.